Sid Meier's Civilization VII has been live for a while now, especially if you handed over a bit of bonus money, and as a history nerd with a penchant for strategy games, I've been pretty hyped. Not hyped enough to fork over the bonus money, which is why the video's only coming out now, but I've at least got some hours under my belt with the new mechanics. I think Civ 7 is making a lot of interesting and positive changes to the franchise, but one of these changes in particular I think might represent, in a novel and likely unintended way, actually a step backwards in terms of historicity. It's one of the biggest and most controversial changes the game is making from the rest of the series, other than the UI, Civ switching. Now, to be clear, I don't really have a problem with it. I think it creates more opportunity to highlight lesser-known civilizations, which they've already done with the inclusion of peoples like Buganda, the Shawnee, the Mississippians, and Hawaii as new additions to the franchise, with, I'm sure, many more unique civs coming in DLCs, because Civ is a license to print money, and we are going to get a lot of DLCs. As well, changing what a leader means to represent cultural, religious, and symbolic leaders, rather than just national leaders, creates a much wider pool of people to highlight and draw from through history. Even from a gameplay perspective, it might be a little silly to play as Lafayette's Han China, transition into Songhai, and then end the game as the Mughals, but there's always been a conceit at the core of every Civ game that it's kinda funny to have America in the hundreds BC fighting a war with China, or the Kree using giant death robots to conquer Moscow in 1880. Ahistorical silliness is at the core of the series, so I don't really see it as a problem, especially if it creates an opportunity to get truly new and unique leaders and civs added to the franchise. That all being said, I do think that by adding in the civ switching mechanic and ages system, there is an impact on the historicity of the game I haven't really seen discussed. See, in every prior Civ game, because you picked a Civ right at the start and played all the way through, there was always at its core an understanding that people from across time and historical context could meld. But now, each age represents a much more important shift in global history, and a shift in civilizations, but this then forces civs to slot within the gameplay implications of those ages. The Antiquity Age is all about the urbanization and agrarian revolution that spurred the first civilizations. The Exploration Age represents the explosion of global trade and oceanic travel of the early modern era, and the Modern Age represents the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution into the mid-20th century. And it seems like from a gameplay perspective, this offers a lot of opportunity to create more variety and especially fix the late game Civ problems the devs have highlighted as a motivation for a more focused and influential age shift as a core mechanic. But there's immediately an issue here. Many civilizations did not participate in these concepts of ages. Buganda may have happened to have existed in the 19th century as a regional African power, but it certainly wasn't a part of the Industrial Revolution or even global oceanic travel and trade, if anything ending up the victim of both when Britain colonized them in the 1880s. In fact, a lot of the current civilizations available don't really neatly fit into this sort of historical transition. In fact, I don't really think most of the non-European civilizations currently available do, except Mexico and America, although their colonial histories play a role in that, and you could even debate them. Even great powers like China or India, where you can transition very naturally from the Han to the Ming to the Qing, or going from the Mauryans to the Chola to the Mughals, neither one really fully fits this mold. The Ming and the Chola did have vast trade networks in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, which fits with part of the Exploration Age, but those trade networks have existed essentially as long as there have been people in those regions, and the Qing and Mughal dynasties both famously failed to industrialize and modernize their states, leading to their collapse, which really undermines their presence in the modern age's powers. And while the Inca and Mongolia reached their heights of power during the rough historical period of the Exploration Age, neither really had any naval presence at all, and in the case of the Inca, this Exploration Age was a calamity for them, rather than a burgeoning of their culture on the world stage. Now, I definitely see what the intention is behind these civilizations, and what the age transition is supposed to represent historically. But because of the variety of ways in which real human societies developed, and the very different practical realities like geography and resources that caused it, not many cultures are going to fit neatly into any linear global framework of human progress, even if it's only broken up into 3 steps. And this has always been an issue in the Civ series, as the demands of game mechanics can reinforce historical presumptions. Civ tech trees are perfect cannon fodder for how game mechanics can reinforce the presumption of linear and predictable human advancement, just as a necessity of building a game system. And I can't really criticize them for designing a game system that prioritizes mechanics and fun over historical authenticity, especially when I said at the start that I never really had a problem with the absurdity of BC's America and such. But I actually think that in a way, the older level of absurdity was actually better. With less distinction between when civs exist in the timeline, how they exist in the game is less tied to real-world history. If America can exist in the BCs, then you aren't really thinking about Babylon building the Hubble Space Telescope. But with new systems, there's now a more specific cutoff where civs exist in certain ages, and then cease to exist as they have traits specific to that point in time. The unfortunate result of which I think is to draw more attention to the ways in which civs don't actually fit into the framing. Because let's be honest, these ages are pretty Eurocentric, and at that biased towards Western Europe. And I think the biggest culprit in that isn't some malicious intention from Firaxis or a major blind spot or bias, but just the simple mechanical realities of building a 4X game. Even the meaning of 4X is kinda rough when you apply it to a historical gaming context. Explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. Certainly all very true to history, but vitally not universal. How would a people like the Aborigines of Australia fit into a 4X gaming framework? Or what about trying to represent cultures that didn't form nation-states with borders and hierarchies that work in a gamified way, like how the ancient Greeks built colonies, but those were essentially independent city-states rather than part of a broader organized empire. I do think that what the team behind Civ 7 is doing will do far more good than harm, to be clear. It's awesome that a game with a massive platform like Civ 7 is going out of its way to promote lesser-known civilizations. More and more, gaming is the media that people connect to history with. The good old days of the History Channel documentary are thoroughly dead by now, and using gaming as a way to increase people's awareness of how vast and unique history is, I think, is an awesome tool to expand general interest and communicate history to the public. But always, the gameplay will come first, and that necessitates a certain concession to mechanics at the expense of authenticity. Is it bad that Buganda and the Shawnee don't neatly fit into their respective ages? Not at all. I would much rather have them in the game than not. And the advantage of civ switching is that if every game you play 3 civilizations, then they can add 3 times as many civilizations, at least theoretically. I think the developers have really gone out of their way to consult with the cultures they're including, and actually work with historians in the game's production, which I really do applaud them for. It's certainly not a high bar, but frankly, so many other pieces of media miss even that mark that it really does deserve to be celebrated when a company takes the time to get it right. And I really do think their intentions are good here. But inherently, a game will never be true to history. Neither will a book or a movie or anything produced with entertainment as a goal. Even this video is an example of entertainment as a motivator over truly promoting history in its purest form. Because of that, it's always important to be conscious of the ways in which design and motivations bias presentation. Just like how human progress is not a linear skill tree of technologies, civilization doesn't fit into a neat and consistent pattern of behaviors. I think the illusion that the Aegis creates, though, might lend more credibility than is due to the logic a 4X game promotes mechanically into how civilizations behaved and were formed. Ultimately, it's either an unforeseen consequence of making a gameplay-based decision, and frankly one I agree with if it makes the late game more fun, or it's a necessary sacrifice to massage a vast and varied array of different cultures into a logic-based system that doesn't really accurately reflect them for the purpose of promoting a more wide-ranging set of civilizations. Either way, it's a balance that any developer attempting to work with a historical subject has to make, because for a game to be fun, for a story to be engaging, or for a system to be balanced, you are always going to have to sacrifice historicity. In this case, it's probably a worthy sacrifice, and as more civilizations fill the roster through DLCs, we may even see a more varied idea of the Aegis system take shape simply as a result of that variety. Although, of course, then you have to question the potential financial incentives of adding as many civs as possible, because, let's be real, having DLCs almost immediately on release is a pretty blatant cash grab. By this time next year, the whole game with all DLCs will be like $300, just so you can have major staple nations like Britain or the Ottomans, which fit much more obviously into the Aegis mold they decided to go with. So it's not hard to feel like they actively excluded these much more obvious civilization choices. I mean, you're going to have an entire age defined by the Industrial Revolution and not include the nation that literally started it? And with that, it can feel like they excluded major powers just so they had fodder for DLCs in the classic cut content from the base game to sell it out in parts and make way more money off of it. It's easy to say you want to improve representation in a game context by highlighting lesser known civilizations, but that runs the risk of creating resentment if it comes at the expense of fan favorites or more obvious choices, especially if it all feels like a cash grab, which would be pretty counterproductive at engendering positivity about those lesser known civs getting a spotlight. Again, I want to be really clear here. I don't really think that the mechanic is a problem. I'm not bashing the game or calling it problematic or anything like that. I just think it's kind of ironic. I mean, this game, by all accounts, seems to be the one in which the dev team has gone to the greatest lengths to consult with the cultures they're seeking to represent and to thereby most accurately depict them in the game. There's a lot of depth and consideration of how civilization is represented. There are no longer roaming bands of inherently hostile savages with the removal of barbarians. And they seem to have managed to keep a lot of good historical flavor for each civ, despite, again, having 3 played in each run. Yet at the same time, by making such a dramatic change for gameplay-motivated reasons, and just by the core mechanical logic systems that pretty much all 4X games have, a lot of that work is kind of undermined. Not to the point of being detrimental, but it does remove one of the best and most essential ways that Civ as a series has always been able to avoid real historical comparison. The ahistorical elements are so obvious and baked in that it all balances out. But now, with a greater influence on the historical divisions, the cracks between real history and the logic of the game seem to show just that little bit more obviously. I'm certainly going to be continuing to play the game, and enjoying it whether I think it's a perfect reflection of the past or not. I just wanted to take this chance to talk about an element of this new Aegis system that I hadn't really seen discussed. If you have thoughts, of course, feel free to leave them down below, and like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and want to see more content that will almost definitely be nothing like this. Thanks for watching.